Vienna, the 1920s. A man walks into a consulting room carrying years of misery, and before the treatment begins, the analyst asks him a single question. Not what's wrong, not when it started. He asks, what would you do if you were cured? And the man answers, he'd leave the job, he'd speak to his father, he'd finally write the book. And Alfred Adler, one of the founding figures of modern therapy, says, well, go and do it then. It sounds like the best advice anyone has ever given. It is also, the psychoanalyst Phillips says, psychoanalysis with the unconscious taken out, because that question assumes the one thing nobody can assume. It assumes you already know what better looks like. Hold on to that assumption. Over the next hour, it is going to cost us everything. And the person who finally breaks it is a 5-year-old girl in a swimming pool. Start with how ordinary the assumption is. Phillips opens his book by pointing out that we cannot really imagine a life that isn't organized around wanting to be better. Politics is bent on it. Private life is bent on it. The better self is always set somewhere in the future, standing just ahead of us, luring us forward. As though, he writes, it is hope that we most want. And notice where that better self actually lives. Not in evidence, in fantasy. Getting better always starts in fantasy, in our imagining better lives for ourselves. He calls it the private utopianism of everyday life, which sounds harmless, even lovely, until you ask who wrote the fantasy. Because a philosopher he quotes has an unnerving answer. Nature aims at nothing. We are our own purpose. We invented the destination, and what we invent, we can revise. So what did we invent? Phillips's answer is bleak and worth sitting with. As though getting better is about getting better at mastery, he writes. As though getting better is a form of revenge. Revenge on life as it is. That's the trap. Not the wish to improve, but improvement recruited as a weapon against the present. And the culture arms it from both sides. On one side, he says, we're handed cruelly exorbitant ideas of change. Redemption. The new people that communism and fascism each promise to manufacture. Genetic perfection. On the other, cruelly diminishing ones. Original sin. Innate malevolence. The unhappy childhood you can never outrun. Grandiose or ruined, and nothing in between. It's an impoverished menu for something we spend our whole lives doing. And underneath both sides sits one shared assumption that somebody already knows the answer. Which is why the next thing Phillips does is describe the way most of us actually change. We change through people. Someone falls in love. Someone reads a book at 19 that rearranges them. Someone hears a teacher and thinks, that's it, that's how to live. Phillips calls this benign trauma, and he means it kindly. Traumas aren't only the things that break us. They are the raw material of development. But there is a cost, and he names it precisely. You can end up trapped inside someone else's vocabulary, simply repeating the words of Jesus, or Freud, or Marx. A bell lettrist named Jeffrey Madan once wrote that all hero worship is the pooling of self-esteem. Phillips answers him with a better line of his own. All hero worship is a division of labor. Somebody else does your believing. Somebody else does your wanting. And once somebody else is doing your wanting, improvement stops being yours. Phillips reaches for Oscar Wilde here, who liked to say that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing badly, which is a joke and also a scandal, because the self-improvement industry is built on the exact opposite. Do it well. Do it daily. Optimize. Wilde's version smuggles in permission we almost never grant ourselves. Phillips's word for what we grant ourselves instead is the original sin of never being good enough. And then he draws the line the whole book will walk. Wanting to make a future better than the present and the past is a good project, but a bad obsession. A good project. A bad obsession. Everything now depends on telling the difference. So he goes looking for the place where the difference gets decided. He goes looking for the word cure. Here is something strange about the profession that sells getting better. Phillips picks up a paper by the analyst Masood Khan, and Khan's opening sentence is an admission. It is a well-known fact, Khan writes, that psychoanalysts shirk using the concept of cure in their written work. They avoid the word. Their whole trade rests on it, and they will not write it down. Why? Because to define the cure would be to name the product, and naming the product would make psychoanalysis simply another commodity in a commodity culture, rather than the anti-commodity it believes it is. And when analysts do name their aims, look at the shelf. One school says the goal is development. Another says it is reaching a state of honest grief. Another says, never betray your desire. Phillips's question is deadly. Are they stocking the supermarket shelves with new products, new ideals for ourselves? The evasion goes all the way back to the founder, and Phillips has the receipts. 1909, Freud writes to Jung, and it reads like a man talking himself down off a ledge. To salve my conscience, I often tell myself, above all, don't try to cure, just learn and earn some money. Don't try to cure. Then, 1933. Freud writes an obituary for his old colleague Ferenczi, and the sentence he chooses as the epitaph is an accusation. The need to cure and to help became paramount to him. In Freud's mouth, wanting to help is what went wrong. And earlier still, the famous promise that treatment can transform hysterical misery into common unhappiness. Phillips will not let that one pass. Common to whom, he asks, or unhappy by what standards? The word common was doing enormous, unexamined work. It still is. Because a cure always comes with a picture of the good life attached, and someone has to have drawn it. Kahn, reading Freud's late slogan about the ego taking the ground of the unconscious, gets carried away and calls it a new human adventure. He describes it as the conquest of the id, a task which so far has been the exclusive prerogative of those gifted and reckless few whom we identify as artists, writers, or mystics. Phillips stops on one word: conquest. That is not a medical word. That is an imperial one. Territory, subjects, administration, improvement imposed for the natives' own good. Read that way, he says. Psychoanalysis had become imperialism by other means. The inner life reframed as a colony awaiting development, and every colonizing project in history has arrived carrying the same document, a definition of better written somewhere else. So Kahn follows the logic to its end, and his conclusion is the sentence this whole book turns on. What is hardest to treat, he says, is not the illness. It is the patient's practice of self-cure, because that is what a symptom is. A symptom is not a malfunction. It is somebody's best available solution, running quietly for years, which gives Kahn his paradox. To cure a cure is the problem that faces us. And then Phillips pushes it one step further than Kahn dared. What is most difficult to resolve, he writes, is not merely the patient's practice of self-cure, but the patient's belief in and quest for a cure. Read that again. Not the wound, the wanting to be healed. They have sought solutions, he says, as a way of taking insufficient interest in their problems. The analyst Wilfred Bion had seen it coming, and he wrote it down in a paragraph that reads like a man losing faith in his own trade. People arrive, Bion says, with an idea of cure they almost certainly cannot get. And then the line that should be printed above every clinic door and every self-help shelf, much analysis and even more psychotherapy is ludicrously omnipotent and optimistic. Ludicrously omnipotent. Not too hopeful. Too certain of what the good outcome is. Elsewhere, Bion puts it as a warning to practitioners. It is necessary to be aware of improvement which may be a denial of something rare in the individual. Phillips compresses that into 5 words that ought to unsettle anyone with a morning routine. Self-improvement can be self-sabotage. Not because improving is bad, because the improvement was somebody else's idea. And now, quickly, the honest fine print, because Phillips is not selling the opposite product. He is careful, and he wants you to be careful with him. He notes that the idea of an analysis with no aims at all is only one radical version among several, suggested by Freud's writing, but never actually stated by him. He says there could be guidelines for treatment, but not maps. Even his most quotable line arrives with a shrug attached. Charles Lamb wrote that it is good to love the unknown, and Phillips quotes it and then immediately takes it back a little. Though it would be truer to say, he writes, that we can't say beforehand whether it is good to love the unknown, we can only find out. That is not a doctrine. That is a man refusing to sell you a doctrine, which turns out to be the argument. So if cure is the wrong word, is there a better one? Phillips finds it in a talk Donald Winnicott gave in a church hall in 1970. Winnicott had gone digging in the dictionary. I believe cure at its roots means care, he said. About 1700, it started to degenerate into a name for medical treatment, care, then remedy. And the whole moral universe shifts with the word. Care isn't a technique applied to a defective object. Winnicott's own sign of health was this: being able to enter imaginatively and accurately into another person's thoughts and to let them do the same to you. Then he adds, dryly, that exorcists and remedy curers do not need it. Face to face, he says, hierarchies drop away, and then the loveliest sentence in the book: we accept fallibility as a fact of human endearment, not a defect, an endearment. But hold on, if we stop knowing what better means, doesn't the whole thing collapse into drift? Phillips has an answer, and it comes from Bion again. Some people, Bion observed, associate all change with catastrophic change. Any movement at all feels like the roof coming off. So they build a cure that is really a cage, something with a fixed shape and a finishing line. Precisely so. That change stays small and supervised. That is the obsession doing its actual job. And against it, Phillips sets the modest aim he states for the whole book, which is not a method and not a program. It is that we might get better at talking about what it is to get better. That's it. A better conversation, not a better technique. So he changes the subject to the thing we think we understand best: pleasure. We assume we know what we enjoy. Phillips thinks that is the wishful part. We can be wrong about our pleasures, he says. Wrong about what they are. Wrong about whether we're having them. Wrong about whether they satisfy us at all. Certainty about our wishes is the most wishful thing about wishing. And to show you the worst case, he points at tragedy. What destroys a tragic hero is not that he wants the wrong thing. It's that he pursues what he thinks he wants without interruption. He is insulated. Nobody is allowed to modify his wanting. As though, Phillips writes, wanting is a soliloquy, and the only relationships he can bear are with accomplices. That's the diagnosis. Not too much desire, too little correction. A want that never had to survive contact with another person. In the first place we learn that lesson is childhood. There's a small, funny scene Freud reports that Phillips loves. Adults, having decided that honesty is the cure, sit children down and explain the facts of life. Properly, accurately, and the children are entirely unimpressed. They nod politely, and they carry on believing their own theories underneath. Freud, in the language of his era, compared them to peoples who'd had a new religion pressed on them, and who quietly went on worshipping the old gods in secret. The phrasing is 1900s, and it dates badly. The observation doesn't. Correct information does not override a private conviction. It just teaches you where to keep it, which means every honest explanation you have ever been given about how to live, including this one, is negotiating with something older that was already there. And here Phillips reaches for a piece of history nobody expects. The phrase unsatisfying pleasures isn't his. It's from 1665. An English Republican named Algernon Sidney, writing against monarchy, warns about men corrupted by vain honors, useless riches, or unsatisfying pleasures. It's a political phrase before it is ever a psychological one, and it is an argument about who gets to define the real satisfactions. That fight is very old and very violent. Calvin called the imagination a perpetual workshop of idols. Diderot, in 1765, prayed for iconoclasts. Moses came down the mountain and found the golden calf. And in our own century, men walked into the museum at Mosul with sledgehammers. Phillips's point is chilling and simple. Pleasures that fail to satisfy the official picture do not get called unsatisfying. They get called dangerous. And once they're dangerous, someone is licensed to smash them. So where does satisfaction actually come from? Not from nature, Phillips says. From training. Pleasure may be the raw material, satisfaction, the artifact. A child is thrilled to ride a bicycle. But that thrill required a culture that built bicycles, and adults who thought this was worth teaching, and an agreement in advance that succeeding at it counts. Bion's version is harder. We have to learn to suffer pleasure as much as to suffer pain. And then Phillips separates two words we have spent our whole lives using as synonyms. Pleasure is not, in and of itself, satisfying. Think of being tickled. And satisfaction is not always pleasurable. Think of the fears of success. There's the crack in the floor. An unsatisfied pleasure has a future in it. An unsatisfying one carries a sense of an ending. And one kind of love, he says, is unsatisfying by design. Freud, writing in 1931, describes a child's love and does not flinch. Childhood love is boundless, he says. It demands exclusive possession. It is not content with less than all. And then the sentence that changes what adulthood is for. It has, in point of fact, no aim, and is incapable of complete satisfaction. No aim. Incapable. Not failed love. Love built without a finishing line. And if that is the template every later love is copied from, then the search for complete satisfaction is a search for something that was never on offer. Phillips draws the constructive conclusion, which is the surprise. Imagine a sexuality, he writes, that thrives on approximation and illusion, one that takes ultimately unsatisfying pleasures as the point and not the problem. The point, not the problem. That single reversal is what the entire book is trying to do to your life, which means you should be extremely careful around anyone promising the complete version. Phillips is blunt about it. A promise of complete satisfaction, he says, can only bring rage, violence, or disappointment in its wake. Complete satisfaction is only for deities, sovereigns, or tyrants. Everyone else is doing something more interesting and less finished. And he notices what happened when we stopped believing anyone was keeping score. The death of God, he writes, is the death of endorsed, legitimated, sanctioned, defined pleasures and satisfactions. Nobody signs off on your enjoyment anymore. That is freedom, and it is also vertigo, and we have been filling the hole with metrics ever since. The anthropologist Marshall Solins said that a society obsessed by happiness must be very unhappy. Phillips extends it. A society obsessed with satisfaction has usually lost the knack of it. And here's the midpoint, where the whole argument turns over. Freud tried to define pleasure and, to his enormous credit, opened by admitting he couldn't. This is the most obscure and inaccessible region of the mind, he wrote, so the least rigid hypothesis will be the best. Then he built a rigid one anyway. Pleasure in that model is the discharge of excitement, getting rid of tension, which produces an absurdity Phillips is delighted to point out. On that logic, the fastest possible sex would be the best sex available, and the shortest experience the most satisfying one. Winnicott's phrase for it is using sex to get rid of sex. And then the line that stops being funny. If the pleasure in life is getting rid of excitement, it is a short step to believing that you need to get rid of whatever or whoever excites you. You already know what better looks like. And better, here, means quieter. So Phillips goes back to the foundation and pulls on it. Psychoanalytic treatment, Freud wrote in 1915, is founded on truthfulness. It's the whole deal. Say everything, hide nothing, and the truth does the work. Except notice what truthfulness turns out to mean in practice. It doesn't mean accuracy. It means saying whatever comes into your head, however stupid, cruel, or false it sounds. That is a very odd foundation for a science. And there's a wrinkle in the translation too. Freud's famous paper reaches English as Observations on Transference Love, which quietly settles the question in advance. Another translator renders it as Love and Transference, which leaves it open. One title tells you it isn't real love. The other refuses to say. And on that difference, Phillips shows Freud's entire theory of cure is balanced. Because Freud had a problem he could not solve, and he wrote it down. Patients fall in love with their analysts. Freud describes a certain type of woman, of what he calls elemental passion, who will not accept any substitute. Notice Phillips says that he never once describes a male patient in this state. With this type, Freud warns, you have a choice. Return her love or suffer the hostility of a woman scorned. And then Freud does something extraordinary. He refuses to dismiss it. You have no right, he writes, to deny the title of genuine to this love. It departs from the norm, yes, but it is precisely these departures from the norm that constitute the essence of falling in love. He cannot tell the false love from the real one. He has, Phillips says, the courage of his uncertainty, and with that, the analyst stops being safe. Sit with what he just gave away. If nobody can distinguish transference love from love, then the treatment is not a controlled procedure, it is exposure. Lacan pressed the knife in further. The better analyzed the analyst, the more likely he is to fall in love with the patient. So Phillips reads Freud's obsession with truth as a confession in reverse. Love is the way we talk about truth, he writes, and truth is the way we talk about love. Freud said as much to Ferenczi. Truth is only the absolute goal of science, but love is the goal of life, which is totally independent of science. And then Phillips lines up the whole modern project in 4 hammer blows. Science as the self-cure for hysteria, empiricism as the self-cure for passion, reality as the cure for wishing, truth as the cure for love. But a cure needs believers, and believing is where the violence starts. And when truth is a cure, it needs believers. Phillips turns to a symptom of certainty itself. The analyst Christopher Bollas described what he called the fascist state of mind, and Phillips adds his own parenthesis. Fascists are phobics, and vice versa. The person who cannot bear a question builds a world with no questions in it. Set against that, Winnicott's definition of madness, which is not what you expect. Madness, he said, is the need to be believed, not the strange belief, the unbearable need for you to agree, which leaves Phillips holding the question that governs every conversation you will have this week, including a video like this one. What kind of truth, if any, is exempt from the urge to coerce assent? And then he finds the moment psychoanalysis discovered it had no answer. 1897. Freud writes to his friend Flies and admits the thing that ends his first theory. There are no indications of reality in the unconscious, so that it is impossible to distinguish between truth and fiction invested with affect. In the place where our deepest material lives, there is no marker for what actually happened. The historian John Forrester draws out what that means. The foundation of psychoanalysis is an absence, a suspension of the capacity to distinguish truth from fiction. Nietzsche had already said the general version. Truths are illusions we have forgotten, are illusions, metaphors gone habitual and drained of sensory force. And Freud, writing about the Judge Schreber's delusions, allows the possibility that history will find more truth in the madman than in the doctor. Phillips's own sentence is the quietest and the hardest. There is truth in the unconscious, but not for us. So what is left to steer by? Not truth. So if truth won't stabilize, what is left? Phillips takes the pragmatist answer from William James. Truth is what happens to an idea, not a property it has, a career it gets, which turns the therapist's question inside out. Stop asking whether the cure is true, and ask instead, where does the cure lead? What kind of life do the cured actually live? And then Phillips lands the accusation that has been circling since the first minute of this book. Wishing is a problem because of its intrinsic omniscience. Knowing what we want can be the most defensive thing we ever do. Defensive against what? Against finding out. Because the alternative to knowing your object of desire is discovering that the wanting itself is the point. The truth of our desire, he writes, is that we desire. Without objects of desire, we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves. Which leaves one last question. Where did wanting come from? Which brings us finally to the swimming pool, Los Angeles. Phillips is in the water, minding his own business, when a girl of about 5 swims up to him, stops, smiles, and announces, "You're odd." He asks what's odd about him. She thinks about it and delivers her finding. "You're not my dad." And then she swims off, giggling towards her dad. It is the funniest moment in the book and the most important, because that is not a joke. That is a report of the first discovery any of us ever make about another human being. He is not the person I was expecting. To begin with, Phillips writes, "For us, people are what they are not. Everyone you have ever met arrived first as a not. And the whole of therapy is one long argument with that fact." Infant researchers used to call it stranger anxiety. Somewhere between 5 and 12 months, the baby meets a new face and dissolves. But the later work turned it around. The child is not overwhelmed by the presence of a stranger. The child is overwhelmed by the absence of the mother. It is the presence of an absence. And Phillips gives it the formulation the book is built on. The experience is of not having an experience. That is not a paradox for its own sake. It is a description of how minds are built. Evolution wired us to notice what's missing. Freud noted that what is bad, what is alien, and what is external all start out as the same thing. And Michel Serres asked the only question that matters. What is it you don't want to know about yourself? There is a philosopher who got there 180 years earlier, and Phillips knows it. David Hume looked at cause and effect and found nothing but constant conjunction. We have no reason, he wrote, to draw any inference about any object beyond those of which we have had experience. Tomorrow is not evidence, it's a habit. And the baby in the cot is a Humean skeptic with no vocabulary. She has watched her mother appear and disappear, and she has no way to know which one causes which. So, Phillips says, she may believe that her mother's presence causes her absence, and that her absence causes her presence. One of those is reassuring. The other is unbearable. And the child cannot tell which theory she is living in. Neither, most days, can we. Then Phillips does something small that rearranges everything. Freud has a famous line: the finding of an object is always the refinding of an object. Every love is a return. Phillips notices what Freud left implicit and says it out loud. The person who finds something she has lost is different from the person who lost it. You do not get it back. You get it back changed, because you changed while it was gone, which quietly dismantles the fantasy underneath most self-improvement and most nostalgia, both of which promise restoration. There is no restoration. There is only a different person holding a different object using the same word for it. That is not a loss. It is the only mechanism by which anything new can happen to you at all, but it depends entirely on how long you had to wait. Before we get to the waiting, one more piece of equipment. In 1925, Freud wrote a short paper on saying no. A patient describes a dream and volunteers. You'll ask who the woman was, but it's not my mother. And Freud's rule is, so it is his mother. Negation, he says, is a way of taking cognizance of what is repressed. Phillips gives it the best image in the book. That negation is like smuggling. You get the forbidden thing across the border by declaring that you aren't carrying it. And once you see it everywhere. I can only be at the party as a shy person, he writes, there and not there at the same time. The denial isn't the opposite of the wish. The denial is the delivery mechanism, which is exactly what a certain small boy did with a piece of string. 1920. Freud watches his grandson, about 18 months old, playing the same game over and over. The boy throws a wooden reel on a string over the edge of his cot, so it vanishes and lets out a long drawn-out, ooh, gone. Then he hauls it back by the string and greets it with a delighted day. There, gone, and there. Freud calls it the complete game, disappearance and return, and calls it the child's great cultural achievement because the boy has managed to stage the thing he cannot control. He turns being left into something he does. But Freud hears a second voice in it too, a defiant one. All right then, go away. I don't need you. I'm sending you away myself. The boy has learned to get better at missing his mother, and Phillips is not sure that is the triumph it looks like. Because look at what the grandfather is doing while he watches. Freud takes a scene of a small boy's helplessness and converts it into a theory. And Phillips asks, is that not exactly the same move as the game? Freud's theorizing, he suggests, may be keeping something at bay. Call it, say, elemental misogyny. Lacan had the general rule: the analyst starts explaining at the point at which he becomes frightened of his curiosity. So the question about the boy becomes the question about all of us. Did he engage with the terror, or absent himself from it through the psychic alchemy of artfulness? Nietzsche's version: we have art that we may not perish of the truth, and Phillips names the limit of the whole strategy in 9 words. Mastery may only make you better at mastery, but at nothing else. And there is a point past which mastery isn't available at all. Winnicott, who spent his life with infants, wrote an arithmetic of it, and it is the most frightening passage in the book. Call the baby's tolerable weight x. At x plus y minutes, the baby is upset but unaltered. But at x plus y plus z minutes, the baby has become traumatized. And then the sentence: the mother's return does not mend the baby's altered state. Something has closed that reopening cannot open. Phillips gives it an adult translation everybody recognizes: waiting for someone you loved who never turned up and whom you never heard of again. And then he compresses the whole thing into one domestic line: if you wait too long to eat, you have no appetite. So how you wait is who you are, and everything depends on your sense of an ending. So we arrive at the last question, which is what change actually looks like when it works. William James, 1907, writes a sentence that is either devastating or a relief depending on the day. The most violent revolutions in an individual's beliefs leave most of his old order standing. James knew the subject from the inside. His father used to tell the children as a family creed, convert, convert, convert. Convert everything that should happen to us, every contact, every expression, every experience. The son took the injunction seriously and then did the one thing that made it survivable. He converted his father's idea of conversion into something he could actually use, which is, Phillips notes, what all of us are doing with everything we were given, not obeying it, not rejecting it, metabolizing it into a form we can live in. James's method is simpler than its reputation. Put all beliefs on a level, then ask what practical difference each one makes to a life. Phillips's summary of it is one of his best lines. Beliefs are experiments in living that are pretending not to be experiments. Pretending because an experiment can fail, and we would rather not have signed up for that. Richard Rorty gave the test its sharpest form. Even if a non-human authority tells you something, the only way to find out whether it's true is to see whether it gets you the sort of life you want. And James applied it to himself without mercy. Asked on a questionnaire in 1904 whether he believed in God because of argument, he answered emphatically no. Because of experience? No. But rather because I need it, so that it must be true. And when a conversion does happen, people are almost never converted to what they expected. Phillips takes the Puritans, who crossed an ocean for a defined destination. They knew exactly what they wanted, he writes, and discovered the sense in which they had no idea what they wanted. The New World would not fit the old vocabulary they had brought to describe it. The poet Frank Bidart says it perfectly. We fill pre-existing forms, and when we fill them, we change them and are changed. The theologian Jonathan Edwards, trying to explain conversion, said it was a bigger event than a man born blind suddenly seeing in the midst of the clear light of the sun, which is a way of admitting he had no idea. Conversion baffles expectation. Or, as the poet Randall Jarrell put it, if I can think of it, it isn't what I want. So how does anything new actually get in? James has an image drawn from home improvement. We patch and tinker more than we renew, he says. The novelty soaks in. It stains the ancient mass and gets stewed down in the sauce of the old. You may alter your house at will, he writes, but the ground plan of the first architect persists. You cannot change a Gothic church into a Doric temple. Phillips's reply is 3 words, and it is the most honest sentence about change anybody has written. Well, you can and you can't. And the world that follows from that is not an empire with one rule. James called it a loose universe, a federal republic rather than a kingdom, in which something else is always self-governed and absent and unreduced to unity. Loose, with sunlight coming through the gaps. James even sorts people by how tight they need their universe to be. The rationalist mind, he writes, is of a doctrinaire and authoritarian complexion. The phrase must be is ever on its lips. The belly band of its universe must be tight. And the other kind, a radical pragmatist, is a happy-go-lucky, anarchistic sort of creature who, if he had to live in a barrel like Diogenes, wouldn't mind at all if the hoops were loose and the staves let in the sun. 2 temperaments, 1 word. And Phillips lingers on how James described sudden conversion. He called it a liability, a word that carries lying down, and legal obligation, and libel. No other animal has conversion experiences. Then the observation that makes it dangerous. Conversion can be the death of curiosity. It wants to stop time. It appeals to the part of us that hates its own development. And James ran the test. If dramatic conversion really produced better people, he said, we ought to venerate it. But notoriously, there is no such radiance. Converted men as a class are indistinguishable from natural men. Some natural men even excel some converted men. There is no mark on them, which quietly demolishes any claim that where you came from settles what you are worth. James thought conversion must be gradual anyway, and must resemble any simple growth into new habits. The sudden, in Phillips's phrase, is just the gradual picking up speed. So the born-again story and the transformation story and the rebrand share one function. They are extreme changes designed to prevent change. Every revolution runs that risk. And that leaves us exactly one honest question, the one Phillips has been walking towards since Vienna. James described the candidate for conversion as someone gripped by his present wrongness, the sin he is eager to escape. And Phillips points at the one word doing all the damage, emphasized. We are the ones doing the emphasizing. The imperfect self could just as easily be called the self that wants something else. So here's the question the book leaves you holding. What would it be to want to change without believing there was anything wrong with us? Not self-acceptance, change without sin, which turns getting better into something with no finish line and no judge. And Phillips's last formulation of it is almost weightless. Getting better might involve simply getting better at changing. You still don't know what better looks like. That was never the obstacle. Ask the girl in the swimming pool. She met a stranger, found out he was not her father, and swam off laughing to find out what else was true.